Good evening, everybody. I think I'm just going to start saying hello, 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 and thank you so much for coming. It's just so wonderful to have such a full event. Thank you for coming out for Deborah and her wonderful book. Veronica Clip from Wits Press, who's the publisher there, the legendary publisher there, who's been there for more than 20 years, is going to do the introductions tonight. So Veronica, over to you, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. It's great to have a launch here again. And thanks everyone for coming. This just a fantastic turnout for Deborah, for whom I think this evening she was saying is a bit of a homecoming after many years spent out of Johannesburg. Well, you've been back for a while, but I think everyone knows her as the founding director of WISER from, I think, 2000, and then you went to UCT and Humour for 13 years, also the founder and director of Humour at UCT. And then you went to the UK for a while, London, University College London, the Institute of Advanced Studies there. So welcome back to Joburg, Deborah. Deborah, of course, has written many scholarly books, quite a few of them with Wits Press as well, including on the history of apartheid, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and on material culture and race in contemporary South Africa most recently. So the conversation with Deborah tonight will be Clive Glaser from Wits University's History Department. He's the author of a number of books as well, most recently A Seed of a Dream, Maurice Isaacson High School, and the Struggle for Education in Soweto. So when Deborah first spoke to us about her manuscript, she was unsure whether Wits Press would be interested in a non-scholarly book. And we asked Clive to offer a view of it, not a formal peer review, but a good read and commentary. And I think he read it very quickly over a weekend, as one does with her book, and saying he liked it very much. And what he liked in particular was the fact that Deborah chose to focus on her least auspicious grandparent. This is far more interesting than a rags to riches and fame immigrant story. So Darker Shade of Pale is Deborah's first non-fiction book, non-scholarly non-fiction book, if I'm not mistaken, though it's steeped in research, and it's a beautifully written and very personal migration story. The focus on an inauspicious grandparent allows her to upend many commonly held stereotypes and myths about life in a shtetl, the possibilities women had or claimed for themselves there, about hierarchies of whiteness in colonial South Africa, and about Jewish exceptionalism. And I think given the extent to which South Africa has been shaped by migrants, both then and now, it's a deeply resonant story. So to give you a sense of the writing, or closing, I want to read the very, very short first chapter. So you'll find that many of the chapters are short, partly because this is a narrative constructed from fragments, from archival traces and unreliable family legends, with more formal social histories offering deeper insights into the familial history. So I'm reading now the first chapter. Migration stories like this one are biographies of longing. Longing to outgrow the pain of departure, longing not to be punished for the audacity of arriving, longing to be recognized and rewarded, longing to love the new face in the mirror, longing to belong. I'll hand over to Clive now. Thanks.
Thanks, Veronica. Yes, in many ways you preempted my first question, which I was going to ask you, which is, I mean, part of what made this such a wonderful read was to was the focus on Maurice, your least successful grandparent, someone who lived a life that was in many ways displaced, unfulfilled. And there's not a lot of writing on this. You're more used to the sort of shtetl to riches story. The only other writing I've seen like this has been perhaps Joseph Sherman's work, who also focuses on a lot of these very lonely, unfulfilled Jewish immigrants. So I want to just start you off by asking you about that choice. How did you come to make that choice?
Thanks, Clive. But before I answer the question, can I just say a quick thank you? Veronica, you already just there you are. Before I start, I just really want to say thank you to Veronica and her team at Wits Press. Karina's here. I don't know if Kristen, I don't know if they're here, but just to say a huge thank you to you guys. You've been impeccably professional throughout this experience, but also so human, such fun, so supportive, so generous. So thank you, thank you, thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you. Okay, why did I choose to write about my mediocre grandfather Maurice? Well, more than that. I mean, actually, he was a man that I didn't really like. So I also had to overcome my distaste in choosing to write about him. But why? In a nutshell, I wrote about him precisely because I did want to write a story about Jewish mediocrity in South Africa's past, not the familiar tale of success and accomplishments. But maybe can I unpack that just a little bit to give a sense of why I did that and therefore what the book is about a little bit. Okay. So some of you might not know, so let me just give you a kind of brief historical sketch of the time in which this is set. So the biggest wave of Jewish migration to South Africa came from Eastern Europe, and that was around in the sort of late 19th, early 20th century. Between around 1880 and 1914, about 40,000 people came, and most of them came from what was then known as the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire. And they came here to a British colony, which was a space that regarded them as dark and dirty. Those were the terms. Those were the terms of the time. And I mean, as you say, Clive, that story has been told. South African Jews have told stories about that immigration experience generally as in triumphalist terms. Stories about people, determined, resilient people who came here and who made good against formidable odds. And as Veronica said, those are often the rags to riches stories, what is it, Barney Bonato, I think, arrived with a box of cigars and became stratospherically rich, powerful, influential, shaped the course of world history, never mind South Africa's. Not everybody was as dramatically successful as him, but, there were several cases of people who did achieve extraordinary success. So nowhere in this exercise do I wish to detract from that. There is an interesting story about Jewish success and accomplishment. But I wanted to engage Maurice's immigrant experience and the immigrant experience in a different way. I wanted to go beyond the triumphalism. I was interested in those people, and of the 40,000, it was surely the majority, those people who didn't make good. What we can call the ordinary mediocre mass. What did it feel like to be an ordinary mediocre Jew in a strange British colony? And Maurice, my grandfather, was one of those. He came to South Africa with his family from a very small shtetl. Small shtetl in Lithuania. They arrived at the turn of the century. He came with his family. And he never made anything of his life whatsoever, much to his abiding unhappiness and frustration. And nor was he the only one, as I say. I don't know how many of you here have Eastern European roots, but if you do, you probably have people in your family who were as undistinguished and as mediocre, dare I say, as Maurice was. So when I started, when I was thinking about writing about Maurice, I had to confront the fact, which intrigued me actually, that I knew absolutely nothing about him. I knew nothing, nor did my family. This was not available in our family repertoire of communication. We didn't know that he came from shtetl, actually. I had to find that out. We didn't know anything about the family back home in Russia. We didn't know why they came. We didn't know who came. We didn't know what happened to them. We didn't know about the experience of coming, what's often nothing. And when I spoke to several friends, some of you are here actually, Jewish friends who've had similar kinds of family backgrounds, they, reported something similar, that the family's immigrant experience and its aftermath is untold. These stories are not told. And it intrigued me why. Why this history that I was wanting to get at? Why is it untold? Is it because these are such really abidingly uninteresting lives? Are these such boringly tedious people that there's nothing of interest to say? Or is there a more active repression? Is there a more deliberate process of historical erasure? And so, choosing to write about Maurice, it's not only that he was, mediocre. Asking about him and going in pursuit of his experience enabled me to ask those kinds of questions. Not because he's typical, and I don't want at any point to suggest that there's any such thing. There's no typical Jewish immigrant. But going after Maurice and trying to pin down as much as I could about him, and I certainly didn't get it all, allowed me to get into writing about what in the book I have called a diaspora of damage. That is the shame and the trauma that the triumphalist narrative leaves out.
Yes, I'm sure that many of us here, certainly I do, we have grandparents who also were not hugely successful, displaced, unhappy. Okay, I wanted to ask you about one of the really brilliant parts of this book is a dissection of the faribel. I don't know when I'm sure those of you who aren't Jewish may not know what a faribel is. It's a sort of long-term family grudge that sort of hovers around for generations. And Debbie's, throughout this book, actually, Maurice himself has a very important faribel that Debbie really dissects it in the most beautiful way. I want to tell us a little bit about it.
Well, let me start by telling you the joke. Okay. What's the Jewish definition of Alzheimer's? Any guesses? Forgetting everything except the faribel. That cuts to the chase, but as Clive says, a kind of a grievance that is bedded down in the emotional archive of a Jewish family, okay? Terrible things that one Jew did to another. Faribels are always about what Jews did to other Jews. So these are communal grievances, handed down from generation to generation. And I became interested in the prevalence of it. I'm just curious, how many people in the room here have family faribels? Okay, it's quite a lot. So I mean, it's fair to say probably that many, maybe even most Jewish families have horribles. And I became, why? I mean, I suppose, the sort of historical sociologist in me asks these questions. When there's a pattern, I'm interested to know why. And horribles, when you do dissect a horrible, I've asked lots of people to tell me about their horribles. There's a kind of a pattern. A horrible is a story about pain, sometimes trauma if it's really bad. A story that's told in a very particular way. Despite the fact, that it's remembered over generations, actually it's usually quite imprecise. The details of who did what to who and why is not necessarily entirely clear, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't get in the way of the kind of intensity with which the faribel is lived and remembered. Maurice, as you say, had a faribel that sort of captured his life and completely determined the shape of his emotional self, I would say. And in fact, it turns out that in his case, not only were the factual details false, they were completely false. His faribel was completely factually untrue, albeit, moored in a bed of, very painful, emotional truth. Sorry. But by looking at the centrality of the faribel in Maurice's life and thinking about it in that way, I think what I came to realize that faribels are actually an archive. They're an archive of a family's emotional experience. And they do a particular kind of emotional work. Not only individually, but I think communally as well. So that's really what I was trying to get at, is to take the faribel seriously as a kind of cultural form, if you like, of the ways in which Jews engage with their past.
So, the book, of course, is not just about South Africa, but it's a very rich story about shtetl life as well. And I think there are quite possibly two aspects of this that I found really interesting and unexpected in some respects about shtetl life. Again, countering the stereotype I think many of us have about shtetl. The first was that there is a great deal of variation of wealth in the shtetl. And some very powerful hierarchies that embed themselves in shtetl life. So that would be the first one. The second is that there was quite a high degree of agency of women. They weren't just shy wallflowers waiting to be married off. They had a life of their own, many of them, and were able to exercise quite a lot of agency. So these two aspects I found very, very interesting and beautifully developed in the story. So tell us a little bit about that.
Thanks. So, yeah, when I started doing this, I should say, not only I didn't really know much about my grandfather, but I also didn't know anything really about Jewish history, despite having spent my life, my professional life writing about the history of South Africa. I'd never really chosen to focus much on Jews in South Africa, let alone, in Russia, where I came from. And I knew absolutely nothing about shtetls, and I sort of gathered, talking also to friends, that we all have a kind of mythic version of the shtetl. I think this is a sort of Fiddler on the Roof version of the shtetl, which was, everybody was doing poor, the Russians just, orgies of violence all the time. These poor abject Jews, who just were subjected endlessly to Russian predation, but kind of, community very tight together. And as you say, that is myth. But that's the myth I think that we hold on to. and probably for a series of reasons that one can explain. But I was absolutely staggered, like you, to discover, and this is, by the way, thanks to a new historiography of the shtetl, which is very luckily for me, of recent years in the making. And there's some absolutely fascinating books that have been written in the past, I would say, 5 years, revisiting shtetl history. And they talk, for example, about that, about the fact that, these were not universally poor, these were not, and the story of Jewish agency, women too, but also in relation to Christians, Christian neighbors in the shtetl. Jews generally were not passive. Christians had the upper hand. Life was not pleasant, very anti-Semitic. But the sort of stereotype of a meek, acquiescent, feeble Jew is rubbish. It's really rubbish. The shtetls were much more boisterous, much more muscular kinds of places. The story of the woman is so ironic, don't you think? Because so most of the boys, you probably know this, most of the Jewish boys in the shtetl had to go to what was called cheder. They had a Jewish education, which was boys only, and it was quite sequestered, quite secluded, very focused on learning the Torah, a completely religious education, not secular at all. And that was not a place for girls, so girls didn't get educated there. And it was one of the ironies of the Russian Empire's policy of Russification, of trying to induct Jews as far as possible into Russia, into becoming more assimilated. They created openings for Jewish girls to go to school, to go to secular schools, and to learn, accountancy, chemistry, history, Russian also, to become very fluent in Russian. And many of them did. And the result was there's this sort of weird discrepancy between boys who were so kind of religiously cloistered and withdrawn, and the girls who were really out there, who were much more worldly, much better informed, and who took a very active part in the commercial life of the shtetl. But Clive, weren't you amazed at what was going on in the Cheders?
Yes, the corporal punishment.
Corporal punishment.
Yeah. Brutal place.
Yeah. So I think you'll find this interesting. I certainly did. At the turn of the century, there was something called the Jewish Ethnographic Expedition, which was a group of Jewish anthropologists, secular anthropologists who were based in St. Petersburg, who decided to go and do some research, on the peasants in the English shtetls to document, these quaint, exotic traditions and the fact that they were starting to die out. Anyway, I won't tell you the whole story, although it's a very fascinating expedition. They did actually end up administering. They produced this massive survey of questions that they wanted to administer. The war got in the way. They couldn't achieve all their objectives, but they have bequeathed this list, this amazingly dense, informative list of questions about life in the shtetl. The kind that can only have themselves be the product of some, pilot research. And there's a section on discipline in the Cheder, what Jewish boys were subjected to every single day, and it is absolutely shattering. They're all questions about violence, about being whipped, being shamed, being humiliated, things like, is it true that on a Thursday everybody in the Cheder is beaten, irrespective of whether they have or haven't done anything wrong? Is it true that the other children are encouraged to spit on the place where the delinquent child is beaten? What kinds of songs of humiliation are sung to the children? You know, it's just unbelievable. And I think it's not disconnected from what you said earlier, Clive, about this sort of obsession with status. It was like, the shtetl was a really, really cruel place, I think. And the pressure to succeed, you know, and to make something of yourself starts like that. If you didn't perform, thwack, you know. But I think that's, you know, that's a surprise for me.
Also, the importance people put on there, which seat they got in the synagogue. Crucial to your social status.
Yeah, you couldn't choose your seat. You had to be assigned, depending on how wealthy or important you were. Yeah.
Okay, the other thing, I wanted to ask you to just talk, because you really, as Veronica was saying, put this together from a variety of fragments. And there are sections which are actually very rich, especially about the shtetl. So I wanted you to say perhaps a bit about your sources, how you were able to pull some of the stories together, both the local ones and the shtetl in the European.
Okay, so maybe should I start with the shtetl stuff?
Yes,
because that's
yes.
the stuff that comes first. And just by the way, I did want to start with the shtetl because I think most of the stories sort of imagine that people arrive here like blank slates, you know, that somehow the only things of interest are what happened to them here, without asking questions about what they brought with them. And I'm not talking so much about material things, but I'm talking about the headspace, which I think did travel and made a huge impact on people's lives here. So I knew, as I said, absolutely buggle about shtetls when I started, but I did decide that it was important to start there. So, as I said, thankfully for me, there is this new historiography. And one of the things that I did, which was incredibly productive, was I got into an email correspondence with some of the scholars who are working in this field, who were very generous. So I had, you know, some really detailed correspondence about, it enabled me to ask the questions that was very specifically of interest to me that I otherwise couldn't really have dealt with. I also used, I don't know if any of you here are interested in your sort of Russian Pale of Settlement past, but if you are, Jewish Gem, which is one of the online genealogy sources of genealogical information, is very good. I used that, I used ancestry.com, and I'm lucky that my surname is quite unusual. There are not that many Posels, which is lucky. You know, if you're Kaplan or Levy or whatever, it's much harder to find anything. But even so, you know, I must emphasize, I came up with fragments. This is a book in which there is no seamless narrative. I cannot tell a whole story. It's punctuated by various kinds of silences, and I make that sort of very clear. So those sources, like the others, are very limited. But when it came to the South African stuff, you know, I did what I've always done. You know, I headed for the archives. I practiced my craft the good old-fashioned way. I went to the archives, and the colonial archives, which we all know, you know, are imperfect. We know they are biased. They foreground some things, they background others, they are partial, you know, in some ways they're blatantly prejudicial. We know that. And it means you have to tread warily and use them with caution. But thank goodness for the colonial archive. I mean, you know, the British were so conscientious and copious in the paper trail that they left, and thank goodness for that. So, you know, I found, as I say, fragments. I found sort of wisps of information. Sometimes a naturalization certificate was useful. Court cases are very good. You know? Court cases, death certificates give you little bits of information. Yeah, so it was a kind of detective work thing, just little bits and pieces, figuring them out, putting them together. When it came to Maurice, it was more difficult because there's nothing in the family. There are no letters, no diary, and only a small handful of photographs. So yeah, I had little to work with. But I did make one decision, which was, how do I deal with the limits of my archive? Because they were limited. And various people suggested to me, well, if there's certain things that you just don't know, then fictionalize. Write a work that is somewhat, non-fiction, where you can make up characters grounded in what may well have happened. I resisted that. For some reason, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write a book that enabled me to take the story as far as I could on the basis of the evidence that I had. So there's a kind of, I suppose, an old-fashioned respect for the evidence in this book. And in that sense, it's quite scholarly, actually. And I suppose that's the historical sociologist in me. But it's not, there was only so far that I could go.
The bits and pieces of the fragments are beautifully interwoven into a rich contextual writing.
Thank you.
One of the places that is beautifully sketched out in the book, that again was quite new in a way for me, was Maurice arrives in District 6. He sets up his first place to set up is in District 6, and you get a picture of a place a bit different from what you expect, very multicultural.
Huge.
And a place of immigrants.
Totally. Yeah, totally. As you know, I was in Veronica, you said South Africa is a country of immigrants. It absolutely is. Most of the black people in South Africa are also immigrants.
Yes.
Very, very few indigenous people who survive. District 6 also surprised me, so incredibly, what would today be called diverse and inclusive. People from everywhere, other parts of Africa, Asia, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Australia, some from Palestine. Amazing. And of course, also, not necessarily only in District 6, but some of them were there, were the Western Jews. The Jews who had already come earlier in the century, who had come from either the United Kingdom, from Great Britain, or from Germany, and who were completely different from these dark and dirty types who stepped off the ship, and who were as despised as much by the other Jews as by the British colonials who they encountered there. A kind of culture clash, and in some ways very open, but for the Jews, highly contested and difficult space. They were going to be civilized. There was a mission, right? There was a civilizing mission on the part of those respectable Western Jews to clean them up, to teach them manners, literally teach them how you serve somebody a cup of tea and a piece of cake in the right way.
And it did seem like District 6 was this place where displaced people sort of seemed to gather. Quite remarkable.
Like that in Cape Town and in Joburg. I think the sort of comparable place was Ferreira's Town, right, in central Joburg. Very similar, also very, very mixed.
All right, my last question before we is to talk a little bit, it's there built into the title of the book, Dark Shape, to say something about Jewishness and whiteness in South Africa. That's, I think, quite an important theme.
It's true,
You've hinted at that.
No, it's absolutely central. What did it take? What did it take to become white? And one shouldn't assume that this was something automatic. And that wasn't just for Jews. I think for Italians, for Greeks, Lebanese, especially Madeirans. Yes, you know everybody about Madeirans. It was initially an open question.
about whether they were white or not. And really what the book is about is, I suppose, that in some ways is a book about that quote-unquote civilizing mission, to sort of, from the standpoint of the Western Jews, to sort of get to erase the Oriental blight, the stain of the East in their brothers or their brethren, if they owned up to that from the East. But in the case of the British officials, to sort of see whether, if and how, East European Jews qualified as white. And those two processes became related. What the Western Jews were trying to do was to rehabilitate Eastern Jews into whiteness, into the kind of way of life, the manners, the practices that would allow them to be seen by the British as recognizably European. Okay, so the discourse at the time was about European, because that if you were considered European, you would count as white. And in fact, in 1902, there was an Immigration Act that put a big clamp on immigration into South Africa, and it made the criterion of getting in being European. So the question was, were Eastern Europeans European in that definition of the term? And it was only when Maurice Posel, who was a prominent lawyer at the time, made the case that Yiddish was a Germanic language, therefore the Jews who spoke Yiddish should be considered European. So then they were admitted as, they could legally fall under the category of European and therefore white. But I mean, in the popular discourse of the time, they were dark. And this fascinated me. When my great-grandmother, Maurice's mother, came to the Cape, she had an official permit of entry that she had to present, which had been issued by the British colonial authority in Libau. And it gave a description of her height, her size, her eye color, her hair color, and her complexion. And her complexion is listed as dark, which is really weird. I mean, she came from, a place of snow and very little sun. She was Ashkenazi. There's no way that she was dark. But actually, that's how Jews were seen. They were dark whites, dark. And in fact, in some parts of Europe at the time, Eastern European Jews were called white Negroes, which is very weird. Yeah. So neither white nor black, some kind of very unappealing, almost nonsensical hybrid of white and black. So whiteness was a ladder. You could start at the bottom if you were lucky, and then you had to prove how civilized you were in order to kind of ascend and make dirt. And as we know, most Jews did, which was a huge opportunity for the second generation. But for the first generation, they were dark and dirty, and it wasn't easy.
Right, should we open up?
There is an opportunity for questions, and we don't have a room time to get. So I'll try and reach you, but otherwise you'll have to speak up if you have a question. I see one hand here. We'll take you to see one other. Right. Okay. Would you mind coming to that side?
Hi. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the very beginning of your discussion, and this notion of the mediocre person and the hierarchy that Clive was interested in. Sorry, the hierarchy that Clive was concerned about, the sort of stratification that starts in the state. So what wasn't mentioned was how that plays out in the more political form. Because what's going on there and is going on in other communities, similar structures, is that they're organized communities. They're not just groups of people who happen to all be Jewish, but they're organized into structures. There are community, there's community infrastructure, there are institutions, etc. And your mediocrity basically takes your voice away within those institutions. So it's your relationship with the other Jews in South Africa changes as a function of how you're seen and how successful you're considered. What a big man you are, basically. You don't have a voice if you're not a big man. And that description of people's sort of deep disappointment with themselves and their families is also about how they continue to be seen in those communities, not necessarily just what's expected of them, but actually fundamentally how they can speak within communities, what influence they can have, and what power that community can have over them and their children, etc.
Should I answer them one by one, Karina?
No, let's get on.
Okay.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm interested in narratives. And as you did your research, you would have pulled threads, and each thread leads you to a narrative. How did you distinguish sufficiently to say this is a history rather than something apocryphal? And how did you deal with contradictory narratives in this process?
Okay, thank you. All right, okay. So the question about Jewish communal politics and the organization that attached to it, and how that intersected or not with a kind of culture of hierarchy. There is a fair amount in the book about the kind of political fractiousness that marked Jewish life and has done for a long time. I mean, the situation we're in now, where there's much more of a hegemony than there was certainly at this time. I mean, even a small shtetl was politically unbelievably fraught. You know, there were very religious types. There were Hasids, there were Zionists, there were socialists, there were communists. People very much at odds with each other politically and organizing in their sort of small political organizations. And yes, having their own kind of structures of authority. And I'm pretty sure that in, a labor union or in the socialist worker or whatever federation, although everybody was supposed to be equal, I'm sure they weren't. I'm sure they had their own ways of deciding who was more important than others. And in a place like District 6, for example, certainly for the first generation, all of that political fractiousness was reproduced. One of the things that I'm really trying to say in this book, in a variety of ways and at a variety of points, is that there is no one way of being Jewish. There is no single version of the Jew. Not culturally, not politically, not socially. And certainly in respect of the politics, you see some of that sense of difference and, quite bitter fractiousness leave the shtetl and arrive in South Africa. So it's the story of Zionism, really, that picks up the question of who was politically a big macher, an important person. And I think already a little bit by the time that the second generation of immigrants was starting to kind of feel comfortable and settled, certainly the third generation, I think Zionism became something of a glue, and the authorities in the community, the people who were represented on the board of deputies or, various other bodies that claimed, always erroneously, they never ever spoke on behalf of everybody because there was not one way of thinking, but they made that claim. And they would have laid that most of those positions increasingly were occupied by people who took a Zionist view of things. And then on the question of narrative, how did I decide? Yeah, I mean, this is quite a loose book. It's deliberately quite loose and fluid. There are lots of things, there are lots of occasions where I decided deliberately not to try and nail something down with absolute finality. I wanted often to be more suggestive and to be more open-ended. And I did that when the kind of evidentiary trail did sometimes lead me in confusing ways or in different kinds of directions. But the process of building the narrative was actually a kind of a snowball, because the way I did the research was I started with my grandfather and his immediate family. Because I knew so little about my grandfather, and I knew that I couldn't really find out more, part of my research strategy was to write in counterpoint, to compare him to the lives of others that I was tracking, people who became the sort of people that he couldn't have become, who made the sort of choices that eluded him. So I partly chose those, to pick up on the kinds of narrative strands that would bring that kind of counterpoint into the storytelling.
Right, there's more opportunity for questions. I see that here. Anybody else? There's one. Do you want that right in this
Hi. Just a small question. Did you look at any comparative immigrant communities? So, for example, as you're talking, I'm thinking to myself, but this is the story of our crowd in New York. The immigrant community, the German Jews, completely shunned the Russian Jews, and as far as they were concerned, they were nothing. So, did you look at any of that? Or
Do you mean, did I look at other Jewish communities?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, should I? Yes. Can I just answer that straight away? So Karen, not systematically, but I did read some of their stories. And in particular, there's a wonderful book by somebody called Alfred Kazin, and Walking the City it's called. And he was a Russian, of Eastern Russian descent, grew up in Brooklyn, in a part of Brooklyn where there were a lot of Eastern European Jews and other Jews, the sort of Jews that regarded the Eastern ones as dirty. And it's very much the same experience. I read a very interesting book by somebody called Hannah Hahn, who is a psychologist and who wrote about intergenerational trauma among Eastern European immigrants in the US, not just in New York, but in the US at large. And it sounds very similar. I mean, there are also questions about the whiteness of those Jews as well. But the way that segregation and racism took shape in America around the turn of the century was a bit different. I think South Africa, it was already much more systematic and much more aggressive than there. But I was also interested, in fact, Clive and I have chatted sometimes. Clive, you did your work on the Madeirans who came. And I was interested in the experiences of other ethnicities who immigrated at the time. And there are striking similarities, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, you've lost your mind.
I lost my mind. Yes, I mean, so I was also, while reading this, struck by a lot of the similarities to their immigrants who were Catholic, darker skinned, unskilled, over many generations, from the 1880s through to the 1950s, mostly coming into the country illegally crossing over the border and having to gradually establish themselves illegally. So they too have similar stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did they have the same journey into whiteness?
They have the same struggle
Yeah.
into whiteness. in fact, it's in some ways more difficult because they didn't have that more established, accepted as part of the community that could sort of absorb it. So they had to fight for it themselves.
Yeah. I think one of the things that's perhaps distinctive about the Jews who came at the turn of the century, rather than some of these other ethnicities, is that so many of them came more or less at once. They didn't come in sort of a trickle like, the Italians or the Greeks, I think. They sort of they came, and so they were very conspicuous and very prominent. You couldn't ignore that there were a lot of Jews at the time, in ways that perhaps Madeirans were less conspicuous.
More scattered, came over a much longer period of time.
Yeah.
It was only when mainlanders and then later the Mozambicans, the Americans who came, they started to become more, I suppose, on less, more noticeable.
We have more questions on this side.
Dave, I wanted you to talk a little bit about what happened to the educated Jewish women from the shtetl when they immigrated to South Africa. What happened?
Yeah, I mean that's a... Okay, sorry, I'll...
So, well, what a wonderful evening this is, and to hear all of this. So, I'm interested in the progression between one generation and the next. You know that, I loved your joke, by the way. And there's another old Jewish joke: what's the difference between a Jewish smos and a Jewish stockbroker? And the answer is one generation. So, and I'm just wondering, I wonder if the Barney Renatos were actually very exceptional in the first generation. But then what happens is that generation lays the groundwork for the next generation, who become, and the reason that the next generation can maybe, succeed is one, because of the whiteness thing. And by the way, I came across a fantastic thesis written in 1990 at the University of KZN about the National Party's conscious decision to change its policy from considering Jews black to considering them white, and what that took, how that choice took place. So that was obviously the one thing that also helped Greeks and Italians and others. But then there was the Jewish institutions. In my own family, an institution that has loomed large is an institution called the Jewish Women's Benevolent Society, a very sort of English kind of a term, in which my grandmother and my mother were very prominently involved, and it was situated in Baker Street in Yeovil. And the job of the Jewish Women's Benevolent Society originally was an alarm over sex workers who were Jews, women sex workers who were Jews, and terrible sort of alarm that this could take place. So they started a society to make, that you called it civilizing, I guess that's it. But then there was the Hebra Kadisha, all of these institutions where Jews kind of helped each other, so I just wondered about the next generation, like in your family. What happened next?
Okay, thanks. At certain points, the questions kind of cross over into each other. So let me start with Hillary's question about, what happened to educated, literate women from the shtetl who were accustomed to high degrees of agency, economically, and for whom motherhood was a very particular experience. This is one of the things that really fascinated me. If you were a mother of a son in a shtetl, you had almost nothing to do with him. He spent every single day, apart from Saturday, in the cheder, morning, noon, until nighttime. So the different relationships with their daughters, but motherhood was a very particular experience in the shtetl. When those women came to South Africa, I think they encountered a much more bourgeois version of what was required of them. Not only from the British, but from the Western assimilated Jews as well, who expected the women to become primarily mothers, taking care of their children, and only if the husband was not the breadwinner should the mother legitimately go out to work. And of course, some of them did have to because their economic contribution was needed. But it struck me that the sort of stereotype, that all the jokes about the Jewish mother and her sons, the Jewish mother smothering her son, that's not a shtetl version of the mother at all. That is what happened to the Jewish women who came here to the colonies and who had who had much more time to spend with their children. And in fact, sorry, this is a tiny aside, but it's interesting, that the literate Jewish woman of the shtetl took to writing. They were writing books, they were writing poems, and they were writing to the articles in the Yiddish press, which had started up in the late 19th century, which was quite vigorous. And some of the poems and some of the articles were about mothering. And these literate Jewish women wrote up a kind of critique of the stereotypical, out there, shtetl mother as emotionally neglectful, as not taking care of their children. So there was already a critique that had developed in the shtetl about mothering and about the need for Jewish women to take better care of their children. And I think that's travelled. So, it was one among many pressures for the woman to conform to a much more familiar bourgeois stereotype of be a good mother, your husband must be the breadwinner as far as possible. But that also, it's not unrelated to what you were saying, Lael, about your grandmother and your mother. Because many of those women who did end up, if the husband could afford to take care of the family finances, many of them were stuck kind of at home and looking for outlets. And Reva Krutt has written, her PhD was a lot about it, has contributed a lot of insight into those women many of whom formed Jewish women's organizations, women's associations, as a way of kind of, at least getting out of the house, but also good causes, charity work, a very strong tradition among Jews to take care of their own. At various points, I was speaking to friends and colleagues who were working on the situation of poor whites in South Africa at this time, and there are many resonances there, poor white people whose whiteness was also in question and who needed to be quote unquote civilized. But their project of rehabilitation from poverty to respectability was undertaken by the state. It's one of the features of the Jewish story that the state had nothing to do, intervened not at all in the sort of civilizing of Eastern Jews. It was undertaken by the Jews, and those women's associations, I think, played a role in that. And then on to your question about the next generation. I think it took time, and I don't think that every spouse became a stockbroker. Not at all. Not at all. The big thing, certainly in my family, my grandfather never went to university, and it was a source of deep shame for him. And it was so shameful because he was well aware that that was the first prize. For the first generation, get your children educated. We know that. And it's not unlike other immigrant communities, Asian immigrant communities in the States, for example, Vietnamese, a recognition that the mobility of the second generation would depend crucially on the extent to which the children of the first generation were educated. And one of probably the kind of biggest gift, colonial Britain in some ways was terrible to the Jews, in terms of their sense of self. Certainly my grandfather completely lost a sense of who he was in trying to become British. But there is undeniably one gift that British colonialism gave to the Jews, and that was access to the university. It was completely open. No, and in Russia, of course, there were lots and lots of limitations. So I think, the university as an institution was absolutely crucial. And Jews were strongly represented in university classes, but nothing like the majority of the second generation went to, or even the first generation went to university. So it's still a minority, a conspicuous minority. But I still think many smokers, either stayed smokers or did a little bit better, but not stockbroker.
Yeah, sure.
One of the interesting things about if you read Joseph Sherman, some of Joseph Sherman's work, he's translated a lot of Yiddish short stories written in South Africa in the early 20th century. There's a lot of single men actually didn't find partners. Many of them lived long, lonely, poverty-stricken lives and disappeared from history. That's a story that's not told.
Not everyone, and the right to marry.
Yeah.
Married out, as they used to say.
Since there's one two more questions, I think that we have to I'm warned for feedback.
Thank you, Debbie. Fabulous. I'd love you to invite you to tell us at which point the communities you talk about start to be able to fall on the domestic labour of Africans, in particular the men and increasingly women. So about cross-racial intimacies, I suppose all sorts, but also specifically in the home. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about fathers and daughters.
Yeah.
Because I was thinking of Fanny Kenneman, who started Vanguard Bookshop. And from the interview that she did with Sam, I think in 84, just before she died, I think. And her family came from Kimberley. And her father, I don't know whether he was a Trotskyist, but he made a point of bringing her into the discussion that he had with his companion Trotskyists, or whatever they were. And she goes on to become a very vociferous and prominent argumentative Trotskyist, and starts this wonderful bookshop. So I wondered whether she's an exception, or whether there's a strand you found in your own work on that.
Okay, thanks. Stephen, so one of the stories that I really like about District 6, and I should say, one of my sources I forgot to say, Clive, the Kaplan Center at UCT had a fantastic project. I think it was in the late 80s, an oral history project. They conducted interviews with Jewish immigrants, and I used those a lot. Actually, I forgot to say. But in one of the interviews, somebody speaks about their servant. They're a family, relatively recently arrived, and they have a servant who, in that case, was a coloured person, who they taught to speak Yiddish. So that was a lovely touch. So definitely, it was. If you could afford a servant, you certainly had one. In District 6, they were most likely to be so-called coloured because the African population there was still quite small. But in Ferreirastown, there's a large chunk of the book that's set in Joburg, in Ferreirastown, and the main character there is my great-grandfather's brother. Okay, and his son becomes my grandfather's nemesis. So, and that's the heart of the furry-bill, if you get into it. But, so I do look in some detail at life in Ferreirastown. And this man, this would have been a great-great-uncle of mine, was a slumlord. He ran a yard
called Posel's Yard. I saw Hilton Jr. earlier, has left anyway, but Hilton will remember that he, Sue Parnell, and I put up an exhibition in 1994 at Wits on the clearance of, central Joburg and turning it into a kind of zone of nice, clean whiteness. And I came upon this document in the archive, Posel's Yard, with all of these tenants. And among them was his domestic worker. So, it's interesting because even in the slum, I think there was a class hierarchy. And if you were slightly better off, one of the markers of your relative affluence compared to the others was your domestic. And in this case, I think the domestic was an African male. So I have no doubt that the institution was pervasive right from the beginning. And, people treated very differently. I should also say that one of the many erasures in the way Jews have told their history is in the relationship between Jewish people and black people, particularly in that first generation. Because I think relationships were in many instances quite close. And I don't mean equal, I don't mean egalitarian at all, but with a kind of day-to-day familiarity and, dare I say, kindness, which are in some instances I would say, and that's all been erased. So I am interested in the book, in that first generation and how Jewish people related to black people and how that memory has completely and absolutely been erased. Okay, and then the next question. So Liz, about Fanny and if she represented her. I come back to the point about there's no one way of being Jewish. Jewish socialists were prominent. As we know, Jews were quite disproportionately represented on the left in these years in South Africa, but the majority not. And so I simply don't know, but I would just hazard a guess, that was relatively unusual. Certainly in my family, the women didn't stand a chance at that time. No.
I think that brings us to the end of our discussion, at least our public discussion tonight. And I want to thank you all for coming, and it was great. I think we heard a lot of the social scientists tonight and the historian in you. Thank you also to Clive, who is the best historian one can get to interrogate that. I have to say the book also has a beautifully told story. It's not all social science, and as you heard from what Veronica was reading, quite poetic and lyrical writing, and get your copy to hear what happened to Maurice. As always, Kate, for hosting us. I think this is our last event for the year with you. Thank you. That was an excellent year for us with you and with our authors. You can get your copy inside the shop, and it will be available to sign copies at the table, as usually happens here. Thank you very much.